Between 1930 and 1940, drought and dust did not just destroy crops across the Great Plains. They dismantled the entire food system farm families depended on to survive. A spoon scraped the last of a thin bean broth from a chipped bowl. Outside, wind drove a wall of dust against a window someone had sealed with wet cloth that same morning. On the table, a piece of cornbread waited, still warm from a stove that had to compete with the wind for every degree of heat. By the end of this list, an ordinary supper of cornbread and milk will explain more about survival than any photograph of a black dust cloud ever could. Decades of overplowing and overgrazing had already stripped away the deep-rooted prairie grasses that once held the soil of the Great Plains in place. When severe drought struck in the 1930s, the exposed soil had nothing left to protect it. The wind did the rest. Before the worst droughts, many farm families produced at least part of their own food. They had chickens, a milk cow, a garden, stored potatoes, and canned vegetables. The farm was supposed to be security, but that security depended entirely on the land still producing something. When the rain failed, fresh food disappeared first. Vegetables needed water, gardens needed time, crops needed soil that would stay in place. The dust took all three at once. A family might still have flour, but no vegetables to serve beside it. They might still have beans, but almost no fat or meat to season them. That was when ordinary ingredients had to start doing extraordinary work. And the plainest of those ingredients is where this list has to begin. If you want to see how ordinary Americans survived with almost nothing, follow for the next forgotten meal. Number 10. Cornbread. What food asks almost nothing from a failing farm and still fills a table every night? Cornmeal could become bread, mush, or dumplings. It required no garden, no livestock, and very little fat to become edible. It was one of the few dishes nearly every household could still attempt, regardless of what else the drought had taken. Unlike wheat flour, which many Plains families bought on credit at a local store, cornmeal could sometimes be grown and milled closer to home. That single difference mattered more than it sounds. It meant one less debt a family had to carry into a season with no guaranteed harvest. Baking cornbread each night stopped being about taste. It became a small act of refusing to let the stove go cold before everyone in the house had eaten something. Cornbread still carries a strong regional identity across the South and the Plains today. What that identity often leaves out is how many households kept baking it, not by preference, but because it was the one thing the drought had not yet managed to take away. But cornbread alone could not carry a family through a full day of farm work. For that, the kitchen needed a pot that could be made to last. Number 9. Beans. How do you make one pot of beans do the work of 2 dinners instead of 1? Dried beans were inexpensive, easy to store, and could be cooked in large quantities. Extension guidance from the period repeatedly listed beans among the most affordable sources of protein a household could keep on a shelf through an uncertain season. If a family still had an onion, a potato, or a small piece of salt pork, those went in too. But the meat was never meant to be the point. The beans created the volume. The meat, when it existed at all, created the flavor. The real skill of a Dust Bowl kitchen was rarely in the cooking itself. It was in the quiet decision made before a single bean touched the water. How thin should the pot be so it would still be there tomorrow? Beans and cornbread remain a recognizable pairing across Southern and Plains cooking today. The modern version is a matter of taste. The original version was a matter of arithmetic, but beans and cornbread together still could not replace every nutrient a family needed. For that, everything depended on one animal a household might still have standing in the yard. Number 8. Milk. What food could still reach the table even after a garden had failed completely? A surviving dairy cow could still produce milk long after the vegetables were gone. For many families, milk poured over cornbread became the meal itself, especially at night. The drought made keeping that cow alive its own daily struggle. Feed and water became so scarce across the region that by 1934, federal drought relief efforts began purchasing cattle from farmers who could no longer feed them. That program was born directly from how severe the water and feed shortage had become. Protecting that one animal was rarely spoken about as a strategy. It simply became the thing a family quietly organized every other decision around. The idea of one dependable protein source anchoring a household's diet did not disappear with the Dust Bowl, but not every family got to keep its cow. Sometimes, the harder and smarter decision was refusing to eat an animal at all. Number 7. The animal they didn't eat. Why would a hungry family choose not to eat the one animal that could feed them for a week? Livestock could mean milk, eggs, breeding stock, or work in the field. Sometimes selling that animal mattered more to a family's survival than eating it ever could. Farm economies were already weakened by years of falling prices before the drought even arrived. That meant livestock was often treated as capital to protect, not food to consume. The decision rarely looked like sacrifice from the outside. It looked like a family choosing to stay hungry today so there might still be income, or a herd left standing the following spring. Modern farms still draw a line between breeding or dairy stock and animals raised for meat. The economic logic behind that separation was hardened, in part, inside kitchens exactly like these. This same quiet math extended to almost every decision made at the stove, long before an ingredient ever touched a pot. Number 6. The math of a thin soup. Would you rather eat well once or eat something twice? A thick stew could satisfy a family for one dinner. A thinner soup, stretched with water and served with more cornbread, could feed the same family twice. Federal low-cost food guidance from the era was built around exactly this kind of stretching. A family's food had to be planned across multiple meals, not judged one plate at a time. Nobody announced this calculation out loud. It happened quietly. In the moment, someone decided how much water to add before the pot ever reached the table. Modern batch cooking and stretch soups are often chosen for convenience. During the Dust Bowl, they were chosen because there was no other option. But when the vegetables ran out completely, no amount of clever stretching could summon food that no longer existed. That was when families turned to whatever they had preserved in advance. Number 5. Homemade chow-chow. What does a family do with the last vegetables before a dying garden disappears for good? Chow-chow, a preserved relish made from whatever vegetables were still available, allowed a small, fading harvest to survive for months instead of days. Home management records from the period describe field agents teaching preservation and canning techniques to struggling households. Chow-chow was one of the simplest preparations because it required little more than jars, salt, and whatever the garden had left. Putting up that last harvest was its own quiet act of hope. It assumed there would still be a later worth saving something for. Chow-chow is still sold as a Southern pantry staple today, usually as a matter of flavor. In a failing Dust Bowl garden, it was often the only vegetable left to offer at all. But some years, there was no harvest left to preserve in the first place. That was when families turned to whatever still grew wild along a fence line. Number 4. Wild greens. What do you call the plant growing by the fence once your own garden has already failed? Dandelion and lamb's quarters were gathered in some plains communities to supplement a diet that had narrowed down to little more than beans, cornbread, and milk. This is one part of Dust Bowl food history no government agency ever tracked. Foraging was rarely counted as part of the household economy. What survives instead is community memory, knowledge passed from neighbor to neighbor about what was safe, when it appeared, and how it had always been prepared. Knowing which plant by the fence was food and which one was not required, exactly the kind of local knowledge that outsiders and later generations rarely inherited. Foraging has returned today as a lifestyle choice for many people. During the Dust Bowl, it was never a philosophy. It was a handful of greens added to a pot that otherwise had nothing left to give it variety. One remembered meal, more than any single ingredient on this list, captures exactly what all of this added up to. Number 3. The meal. A family still called good. What does a good dinner mean once almost everything else has disappeared? In one remembered account, preserved in oral history collections from the Southern Plains, a woman recalled her family living largely on cornbread, beans, milk, and homemade chow-chow. And she still remembered it as good food compared with what many neighbors had. Stories like this capture what no federal ledger or price index ever could. They reveal how a family itself defined enough. The quiet turn in that memory is not the menu. It is that the family knew its own definition of a good meal had become smaller and chose to call it good anyway. Today, that same meal might sound like the bare minimum. During the Dust Bowl, it represented something closer to stability. It was familiar, filling, and still there when so much else was already gone. But even that meal depended on resources that were slipping away, one at a time, underneath a family that still legally owned its own land. Number 2. When owning land stopped meaning food. What happens when owning land no longer guarantees having something to eat? A farmer could work a full day and still lose the crop to wind and drought. A family could hold the deed to hundreds of acres and still have no cash and no food in the house. By 1934, drought conditions across the plains had become so severe that federal relief efforts began purchasing cattle from farmers who could no longer feed or water them. That program only existed because ownership of land and livestock had stopped translating into real security. The contradiction was rarely visible from outside a family's front door. A household could look, on paper, like it had everything: land, a herd, a name on a deed, and still go hungry inside its own kitchen. Modern farm safety programs and crop insurance systems trace part of their history back to this realization. Owning land was never by itself the same thing as having food security. And when even land ownership stopped being enough, some families did the one thing the soil itself could never force them to do before: they left. Number 1. The meal that traveled west. What do you pack for a trip when you do not know where you will sleep next? Roughly 2.5 million people left the Dust Bowl states during the 1930s. Many carried only what could fit inside a car or a truck. They left behind houses, animals, and entire farms, but they carried food knowledge with them: beans, cornbread, preserved vegetables, milk when it was available, meals built to be made cheaply, and stretched across as many people as possible. The recipes changed as families moved. New ingredients appeared along the way. Old ones became harder to find, but the underlying principle never changed. Use what is available. Waste nothing. Make one meal outlast the day it was meant for. This is number 1 because it refuses the comfortable version of the story. Cornbread, beans, and chow-chow show real ingenuity, but the migration shows ingenuity's limit. No amount of careful cooking could replace rain, income, or a home that no longer existed. These meals should not be romanticized as proof that people simply knew how to get by. Stretching a pot of beans across 2 dinners, preserving a fading harvest, or knowing which wild green was safe to eat all required real skill. Needing to do all of it at once with no guarantee of rain or income the following season was not simplicity. It was deprivation, managed as carefully as anyone possibly could. The response built out of this crisis was not limited to what was served at the table. Federal soil conservation policies, drought-era livestock programs, and later farm safety systems all trace part of their origin to this decade. It was a decade when it became impossible to deny that land ownership alone could not guarantee a family's next meal. The thread connecting every meal on this list was the same: use what remains, waste nothing. Make it outlast the day it was meant for. The documents behind these meals do not turn that into a universal story for every Dust Bowl family. They reveal recurring strategies, and they also reveal the families who eventually ran out of anything left to stretch. The legacy of that decade lives on in soil conservation programs, drought relief policy, and an unfinished conversation about what happens when farmers do everything right and the land fails anyway. Cornbread, beans, and milk kept a family fed as long as they still had a kitchen to cook in. But for the families who finally left the plains behind, the next challenge was feeding themselves with no kitchen at all, on the road, in migrant camps, with whatever could be cooked over a fire built on someone else's land. Follow for the rest.